Welcome, everyone. I am Kimberly Cowell-Myers. I'm faculty in the Department of Government, the School of Public Affairs at American University. And I'm delighted to have you here with us for this discussion of the interim report of the Working Group on Unification Referendums on the island of Ireland. We have today two members of the working group to present the key findings of the group with regard to their interim report. The first is Alan Renwick, who is the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit at the University College London. And the Constitution Unit is the primary host of the working group. And also Brendan O'Leary, who's the Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also a member of the working group. On behalf of the School of Public Affairs, I'd like to thank you for coming and to welcome you to the session. I would ask, of course, for the purposes of making sure we can hear our presenters most clearly, that if you would please leave your microphones and your cameras off until we get to the Q&A. And if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. You will find an opportunity to do that through the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom window. And you can also mention in the chat, if you'd like, that you have a question to ask if you're not able to make use of the reactions button. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Alan and Brendan, and thank you again for being with us.
Well, Kimberly, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to all at the School of Public Affairs who've helped to organise this event. I'm really delighted to be able to join you and delighted to see so many people joining us here now as well. So as you've said, we're focusing on one part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, namely its provisions on how a decision could be made on whether Northern Ireland should become part of a united Ireland. That's been the focus of our working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland. So I'd like to give you just a very quick introduction here to three things. And then Brendan might expand on some points a little bit further. So I'd like to say something first about why we created the working group, then the nature of the working group, and then the group's interim conclusions. So in terms of why we created the working group, we did so because referendums on the unification question might happen. And if they happen, it's important that they be conducted well. But they'll be conducted well only if someone thinks through what that would involve. These are going to be complicated processes if they do take place. And no one has yet done that thinking, so we wanted to help fill that gap. We didn't create the working group because we thought that referendums are imminent. The evidence is that a majority in Northern Ireland would currently vote for maintaining the union with the United Kingdom, not for unification in Ireland. But clearly, no one can know how opinion might evolve over time. These are very uncertain times, particularly given the as yet unclear impacts of Brexit. On the nature of the working group, so the group is looking at how any future referendums on this question, on the question of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, would best be designed and conducted. We have no collective view on whether such votes would be desirable or what the outcome should be if referendums were held. So that's a very important feature of our project. As Kimberly said, the group is based in the Constitution Unit at University College London, and it comprises 12 experts from Queen's University Belfast, Ulster University, Trinity College Dublin, University College Dublin, and Brendan at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as those of us at UCL. And the expertise of the members of the group spans political science, law, sociology, and history. We have pooled our own expertise, and we've also consulted with a wide variety of people, including politicians, retired officials, academics, journalists, people from civil society, and so on, and also members of the public through a public consultation that we ran last summer. We published our interim report towards the end of last year, setting out our draft conclusions. And now we're seeking as much feedback as we can on those before we finalize the final report of the group, which is why we're here today, in order to hear your thoughts. So let me turn to the interim the group's interim conclusions. I'm going to give you only some highlights. It's a detailed 200-page plus report examining very complex issues. But just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we cover. So as a starting point, we assume that any referendums on this issue would be conducted within the terms of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And so we start in the report by setting out what that entails. As I think is well known, unification could not happen without a referendum vote in its favour in Northern Ireland. And we conclude that a referendum would be required in the South as well, either amending or replacing the Constitution. It lies in the hands of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, that is the minister in the UK government responsible for Northern Ireland, to decide whether a referendum in Northern Ireland, a so-called border poll, will take place. He or she may call such a vote at pretty much any time and must call a referendum if a majority for unification appears to him or her likely. How the Secretary of State should make that judgment is, however, not specified. A referendum in the South wouldn't have to be on the same day as the vote in the North. It could come later, but substantially the same proposal would have to be put to voters both North and South. The threshold in each referendum would be a simple majority, 50% plus 1. If that threshold were met in both jurisdictions, then unification would have to take place. So the majority principle applies to the decision on sovereignty itself, but on other matters, the 1998 agreement's wider ethos of seeking to proceed by consensus should, we argue, be upheld as far as possible. So that's the framework provided by the 1998 agreement. There are a few more things in there, but that's essentially the framework that it provides. There are many other matters, however, that the agreement does not resolve. And we explore these using 5 criteria to assess the options for how any referendum would be organized. Those criteria relate to procedural legitimacy, stability, simplicity, informed choice, and inclusivity. And let me just state 3 broad conclusions that we reach based on these criteria. First, we conclude that it would be highly unwise for referendums to be called without a clear plan for those referendums themselves and other associated processes. As I said at the start, these would be complex processes and poorly designed could lead to problems. Such a plan for the referendums would need to be agreed by the governments in close consultation with each other, so the governments of Ireland and the UK. We do not say when such planning should begin. We recognise that that's a politically very sensitive matter, but a plan should be agreed by the time any referendum is called. Second, there are several plausible configurations of referendums, North and South, with referendums coming either early in the process, before the details of a United Ireland have been worked out, or later, once a plan for a United Ireland has been developed. I won't go into detail now, but this is perhaps the toughest and most important issue. There's no perfect approach. Each configuration has advantages and disadvantages. So developing a plan for a United Ireland first, before the referendums, has the advantage that it allows voters to make an informed choice, knowing what a United Ireland would actually look like. But if you design a United Ireland before a referendum, then it's reasonable to suppose that unionists, supporters of Northern Ireland staying in the United Kingdom, will not participate in the design process. Their focus, presumably at that stage, would still be on making the case for the existing union, not planning for its demise. So if you want the form of a United Ireland to be shaped by all parts of its society, then there's a strong case for leaving design work till later. But then, of course, on the other side, the choice that voters can make is not so informed. So that's the second conclusion. And then very, very briefly, because I'm taking too much of your time, the third conclusion, final conclusion, the conduct rules for any referendums themselves would be crucial. Existing campaign rules are badly out of date in the digital age in both the UK and Ireland, as they are in many other countries, and they would urgently need to be strengthened before a vote was taken on an issue as important as this. So as I said, those are just some quick headlines, but I hope they give you a bit of a flavour of what the working group is about. As I said, it's an interim report presenting draft conclusions, so I'll be really keen to hear your feedback on our report. But before I do so, I think we're going to hand over to Brendan in order to elaborate a bit further.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think I'm unmuted. Scream if I'm not. I would like to commend Alan both for what he's just said now and for his judicious chairmanship of the working group. The working group is comprised of people with all sorts of values and background. We have a common academic profile, but we include people who are generally in favour of a united Ireland, if it could happen democratically and reasonably, and we have people who favour the continuing union. We have nationalists, unionists, and others in disposition. So this was a fascinating group to work with. We fought and negotiated every subclause in a good spirit, and I support the interim report. It is an interim report. We expect to modify it in light of feedback we get. So if you are willing to read it and to respond, we will be delighted. What I'd like to do is, apart from making one supplementary comment in relationship to what Alan has said, is to raise a couple of questions on which your opinion right now would be welcome. And you don't have to simply confine your response to what either of us suggest, but I'm going to suggest a couple of matters. The comment is this: we all agreed that the referendum of 2016 in the United Kingdom was catastrophic from the point of view of democratic process. Whether you favoured remaining in the European Union or leaving, the actual process was an absurdity. That was because it was not made clear, in particular, what leaving would mean. There was no clarification of to be fair, there was insufficient clarification of the status quo, and there was no adequate clarity as to what leaving might mean. And that produced a policy fiasco for the next several years as the British Parliament debated what actually leaving meant. And as everyone here knows, Northern Ireland was considered a side issue, both in the process running up to the referendum, and it became a shibboleth in the negotiations over the design of the UK's final exit. And as a result, it's produced a brittle, fascinating protocol, which is underway as we speak. So we were concerned collectively as a group, I think, to avoid any comparable repetition of that process as and when there might be referendums on unification in the island of Ireland. As Alan said, we are all agreed that unification referendums are not imminent, but we are also of one mind in thinking it's possible that they may come earlier than anyone has expected, and therefore at least some of the group emphasize preparation now, though others would argue it's prudent to wait a little bit longer. So the first question I have to pose to you as a group is this. I'm going to read a passage from the Good Friday Agreement. It's actually the third paragraph of the Good Friday Agreement, at least in the edition published by the United Kingdom government in 1998, before the referendum that was endorsed in the north and in the south. And what it says, I will read slowly and carefully. The British and Irish governments recognise that it is for the people of the island of Ireland alone, comma, by agreement between the two parts respectively, and without external impediment, to exercise their right of self-determination on the basis of consent, freely and concurrently given, north and south, to bring about a united Ireland if that is their wish, accepting that this right must be achieved and exercised with and subject to the agreement and consent of a majority of the people of Northern Ireland. The clause I wish to bring to your attention is without external impediment, quotation marks. Our lawyers on our group think that this has no effective force. Those of us familiar with the drafting of the agreement and the history running up to it think that it was deliberately intended to make the island of Ireland a common public space for deciding these questions, and deliberately to exclude outside obstacles, among which might be, for example, the British government, among which might be, for example, Irish Americans with enthusiastic preferences. Do you think, as legal scholars or as political scholars, that this phrase, without external impediment, has any meaningful weight? Would it, for example, constrain the legitimacy of Conservative Party preferences during a referendum? Should we expect the Conservative Party to commit itself to play no role in arguments on either side? That may well be the position of the British Labour Party, but does the agreement oblige that position to be taken by the Conservative Party? Do you think that notion of impediment has any legal meaning? That's one question on which we'd welcome commentary. The second point I'd like to bring up is related to what Alan explained. I'll use slightly different language. The government of Ireland, in my view, has to make a choice between offering a precise model of a united Ireland before any referendums are conducted, or offering a process through which a united Ireland would be deliberated upon and finalized. The choice is model or process. It's not that simple, however, because the process would have to have a default. If, for example, the government of Ireland said, if there's a vote for unification, north and south, then we'll have a constitutional convention. After the constitutional convention produces its result, that will presumably have to be ratified according to the relevant ratification rule. But it is possible that the constitutional convention might be a failure, that people might not agree on a new or replacement constitution, in which case Ireland would have to unify under its default constitution. I say this to emphasize that the real impetus and onus is on the government of Ireland to prepare and clarify what will happen in the event of positive votes for unification. And the question I have to ask you is I think, an interesting question of normative preferences. Do you think it is appropriate that the constitution of a future united Ireland should be negotiated while British sovereignty persists in Northern Ireland? Or is it more appropriate for the Constitution of Ireland to be negotiated under Irish sovereignty? That is, after giving effect to the repercussions of the referendum, presumably under a default Irish constitution. So, to simplify the question, if there are positive votes for unification, how should the new constitutional arrangements of Ireland be negotiated? Under British sovereignty or under a quick transfer to Irish sovereignty? Comments welcome. I do urge you, if you have time on your hands, to read the entirety of the report. We've tried to consider virtually everything. That doesn't mean we have all collectively achieved the right result in our arguments, and we do genuinely welcome criticism. I'll shut up now, and we look forward to questioning. I think Kimberly is going to come back and chair the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. And in order that I don't forget, I do want to thank our events team for coordinating all of this and making it possible. I had a couple of thoughts for you, not necessarily directly on the two questions that you asked, Brendan. We'll make sure our respondents, participants have an opportunity to weigh in on those things if things occur to them in response. Having read the entire report, and I commend it to all of you, if you have not yet had that opportunity, it is 259 pages long, I think, if I'm not right. I have a little eye strain, so the numbers kind of wobble at this point at the bottom of the page. But one of the questions that the working group has asked for feedback on in their interim report is, did we miss anything? And I would offer to the working group, it's almost not possible for you to have missed everything. You've been so thorough. And so the interim report you have produced is, I think, going to be extraordinarily valuable. It is a tremendous document that one has the experience kind of having turned over every stone, right? We've taken a look at kind of every possibility that could come out of this and tried to understand the implications. And to me, there are some key challenges identified in that report. Timing is crucial, and Alan, I think you said something along the lines of what could produce some problems, and I think that's it's a little tongue-in-cheek. It's a little of an understatement of the problems, the scope of the problems that can be produced if the timing is wrong on this. The referendum, calling it at the wrong moment has the potential to be hugely destabilizing in a variety of possible directions. When you read all the possible outcomes, negative outcomes contained in the report, you sort of find yourself in the corner, kind of rocking back and forth, saying, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You barely know, what to hope for in terms of an outcome. But the report goes very thoroughly through what criteria should be used, as Alan mentioned, by the Secretary of State in making the determination over when to call a referendum. And all of those things have to be weighed, because doing so or not doing so is so fraught. Another key challenge that I think was very clear, and to me, some of the most exciting parts, and you all talked about some of the most difficult parts to write in the report, were with regard to sequencing. Whether the details, as Brendan is talking about, are worked out ahead of time or not matters for the outcome of the referendum, right? And that is, very clearly highlighted at different points in the document. But questions like the division of liabilities, the issue of offsetting the subvention, in particular, healthcare is like the #1 issue that seems to be driving people's attitudes about unification, interestingly enough, and the provision of other public services. All of these things lend themselves to a sequence where those critical pieces are worked out in advance in order for people to have informed consent, in order for them to be able to know what they're actually voting on. And also process. The working group has done a good job of identifying the challenges in terms of thinking through the process. There are going to need to be tighter rules in all jurisdictions with regard to the conduct of the campaigns, ironing out the differences in possibilities in terms of the franchise. Do we include European citizens in particular or not? And then the wording of the questions, and all of these have, all of the available options they've attempted to articulate here. And all of them have, benefits and risks as well. Clearly, all of those things would benefit from cooperation between the governments. And I might be a bit skeptical with various figures about the goodwill of various figures, but I think we could assume that no one wants this to go badly. And so there is a desire, I would think, from both governments to work out some of these pieces. The other thing is the uncertainty of, we attempted to compare this to the 1998 referendums on the Good Friday Agreement. And those were a consequence of decisions arrived at in multi-party talks and involving both governments. And there was a lot of media attention when people actually went to vote in those referendums. They knew exactly what they were voting for. It's very different than, for example, the 2016 process in the United Kingdom. But we don't know if during the process of campaigning and figuring out some of this, what would happen to public opinion that is the necessary criteria for making the decision to hold a referendum. Right, so there's a lot of uncertainty woven into this that, again, would cause one a great deal of anxiety if one was responsible for recommending the timing of this referendum call. So I do have a few questions to the working group that I would suggest perhaps are worth thinking through. One of them is you talk about the criteria for assessing referendum processes, including things like procedural legitimacy in the eyes of the public, and then also in legal terms, stability throughout the island of Ireland in the short term and the long term, simplicity in the referendum process to limit the risk of confusion among the voters, the ability of voters to make an informed choice among the options that are available to them, and then inclusivity. And so I think these criteria are highly valuable and worth applying. But my question to you is, are they equally meritorious? And is it, we don't necessarily have access to the thought process among the members of the committee. I did think that it would be fun to sort of put to you, is the report a result of your collective judgment, or is it a committee process? In other words, this was the stuff we could leave on the table, or this is the stuff all of us think is the best possible outcome from this process. So I'd be interested if you had thoughts on, and if the thoughts could be shared across the working group, or characterized as shared across the working group, or if they're representative of particular constituencies within it, about the merits of these criteria for evaluating processes. I did wonder about the necessity of preparatory work. I mean, that comes up again and again and again in the report in different places, that referendums should not be conducted well without extensive prior preparatory work. It's not possible, you make the point, it's not possible to make a purely abstract choice about the principle of sovereignty. I mean, we can't just say to people United Ireland or United Kingdom, because they don't know what a United Ireland would be. Right. So in order for them to make informed decisions, they would need some of that work done ahead of time. And I'm wondering, you offer 3 options in terms of sequencing of when to make those determinations: before or after the referendum, and then before and after the transfer of sovereignty. And I'm wondering if, you recommend all 3 of those as sort of meeting the criteria, meeting the threshold for supporting, but I wonder if one is not maybe preferable. And if the working group had a sense of that collectively, if that's a space you think will evolve in the transition from the interim report to the full report. I have so many questions. I have 11 pages of notes, but I think it's not fair. So I'm going to ask if you all had some thoughts in response to that, and then I want to make sure to open it up to all of our many guests who are present here and might have questions for you.
Those are great comments. Thank you so much. The really rich sense of how you have responded to the report and what points you have found most salient. And that's really, really helpful for us, actually, just to see how someone reading this report processes it. So that's great. Thank you so much. In terms of your particular questions, let me deal with the last one first, about the various different configurations that we set out for referendums, and whether we might be able to say that one is clearly the best. I mean, I think that is an issue where there are different views among the members of the working group, and I think it probably isn't especially helpful for the working group to display too much exactly what the different views are within that, because ultimately these are very important political questions that will require a great deal more examination beyond what the working group has done. What we're seeking to do in the working group is start a conversation, and we're able to show these various configurations that we think are plausible. And we started off in our explorations. At one point we had 64 possible configurations of referendums on the table that we were thinking about, and we managed to narrow it down to 3, which we think is going reasonably far. But at that point, it's really for others to take up the conversation and the thinking on how these different configurations should be weighed relative to each other, which relates also to the question of criteria and whether we were able to, whether the criteria are different in terms of their merit. you listed the criteria that we have there, and one of those criteria we did indicate is somewhat secondary to the others. So the criterion of simplicity, we indicated, to some extent you need to give up on simplicity if that is needed in order to ensure that people have an informed choice, that there is maximum inclusivity in the process, and so on. We haven't sought to attach weights to the other criteria. And again, I think we probably won't in the final report attempt to do that, because again, these are matters of judgment, including political judgment, and not simply matters that can be decided by academic analysis. So we want to encourage further conversation on that. We don't want to suppose that we have got the final answers on that.
So I agree with Alan that it wouldn't be productive to report internal unresolved issues within the group. We did do remarkably well in cutting down 64 logical options to 3, and we did agree to eliminate 2 scenarios that we thought were plausible, and that was a testament to the working group. I think I'm not spilling anything when I say that the biggest tension was between emphatically recognizing the majoritarian process envisaged in the Good Friday Agreement for resolving the sovereign status of Northern Ireland and the principle of inclusivity. The principle of inclusivity could not be extended to give a veto right to any party or movement over the final status question. And we worked very hard to achieve reasonable language on that. We want to see as much opportunity for all kinds of views to be represented and articulated before a referendum, but not to give any party a veto if the criteria are met for a referendum to be held. You're quite right, Kimberly. There's no science of campaign effects. And the bizarre thing is that if you look at what the Secretary of State is obliged to do, is the Secretary of State is obliged to predict an outcome. And the Secretary of State can do that on the basis of a social science degree on surveys, a political stroke social scientific judgment on polls, or he or she could make a decision on the basis of election results to the Assembly, or even conceivably to the Westminster Parliament. It's not legally watertight what criteria that person is supposed to make their definitive judgment on. And they don't know what will happen the moment they trigger the process, because there will be a campaign. Campaign effects will matter, and it could be that it looks afterwards as if the call should never have taken place. So we are fully cognizant of that process and difficulty. But in terms of preparation, you're right, Kimberly. That's what went to every household in Northern Ireland. It's a 30-page document. In the case of a unified Ireland under any model, I think something like 650 pages of text would have to go everywhere, probably electronically rather than through the traditional mail. So the question of preparation is vital. It is something that we've discovered in our interactions with people, that substantive public service questions are important to many people, more important than arcane constitutional questions. But that said, it's vital that politicians, particularly in the South, sketch out clearly what the constitutional arrangements are likely to be. And only then can you have a coherent conversation on how public services will be organized. And I agree that health will be one very important subject, and arguments will go both ways. What we are clear about is that it's possible that there are many versions of unification. One could involve assimilating Northern Ireland into the current republic. Another could involve merging the best of both places. So you could imagine a new All-Ireland health service, but you could imagine the Southern education system becoming the model for the whole island, and so on. There are mix and match opportunities. All of those things are best planned, deliberated upon, and considered beforehand. So if we make a small contribution to that process of necessary deliberation and preparation, I think we'll all be pleased.
Thank you very much. I'm beginning to notice questions populating in the chat. I would like to, I'll call on those people first, and then I would like anyone else who has a question to please raise your hand, and if at all possible, I'll try to grab you that way. And if you do have difficulty making use of the reactions button where you can raise your hand, please feel free to put your question in the chat. So Ted Smith had asked a question a little while ago. Ted, did you want to unmute yourself for a moment? Maybe turn your camera on.
Sure.
Would you
can you hear me now?
We can. Would you mind identifying it? Just everybody, when you
Sure.
unmute, would you please tell us where you're from? I know Ted, but yes.
Thanks, Kimberly. Ted Smith. I'm president of Luxman Ireland House at NYU and also chair of the advisory board of Clinton Institute at UCD. Congratulations, Alan and Brendan, on the working group report. My question is, given the growing unrest in Northern Ireland about border issues, how can we best reduce tensions in the next 5 years when the struggle for the union or reunification will intensify? And in answer to Brendan's question, one option might be to guarantee unionist rights in the new constitution before the referendum, guarantee those in the Republic, and those rights can only be altered by a 2/3 vote in the future Ireland. I mean, there could be, as Brendan just said, there could be lots of other ways to try and reassure people. And finally, what's going to be the impact if Scotland goes independent? What union are we talking about then? It'll be a union with England largely. So these are, ongoing considerations. But thank you very much for your report.
Should we respond, Kimberly, seriatim, or?
What would you like to do? Would you like to get a couple more?
I'm happy to respond if Alan is.
You go for it, Brendan. Yes, absolutely.
So you're absolutely right, Tim, to point to current difficulties and tensions. We'll see to what extent those are orchestrated or represent deep public anxiety. I think the protocol, however well-designed and well-intentioned it is, and I concede high marks to it on both counts, it has been implemented with maximum feasible insensitivity, with insufficient time for people to get used to the idea. And therefore, we are seeing the consequences. It tells us exactly how important it is when making major changes of deep constitutional, political, and economic significance, that you prepare people in advance. It doesn't mean that afterwards everybody's going to be satisfied, but in the balance of winners and losers, the losers must see that their interests have not been totally ignored or abandoned. Ted is right. It's up to the government of Ireland to make clear what the rights of Ulster Protestants and British citizens will be in a future United Ireland. And here there's a very clear and simple choice. The Good Friday Agreement, in the view of all members of the working group, obliges the transfer of full British citizenship rights for anybody in Northern Ireland who wishes to keep them, though the maintenance of that right rests with Westminster. It's quite clear that Ireland is obliged to recognise the maintenance of those citizenship rights. Whether the rest of the Good Friday Agreement arrangements, including the power sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland, transfer into United Ireland is a separate decision. That's not automatically obliged by the Good Friday Agreement. So I think it is vital, as you suggest, that the Government of Ireland make clear what the pattern of rights protection will be in a unified Ireland, and whether there will be significant changes to the way political institutions operate. As you say, a qualified majority vote, perhaps it's 5/6 rather than 2/3, might be required to change certain kinds of rights. And you're absolutely right. If Scotland departs, that means the Union of Great Britain is dissolved. what is Northern Ireland in union with then? A long time ago, the Scottish National Party made a choice on that question. They're saying basically Scotland will not be unified with Northern Ireland in those circumstances. England would be the successor state. And I think everybody agrees with that. But would that call for a renaming of that union, for a restructuring of it? Almost certainly. So there will be significant consequences if there is a Scottish exit in the next 3 or 4 years. And I think most people are quite conscious of that.
Good, thank you. I noticed Saul Newman had asked a question about question wording. Saul, are you there?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for organizing this, Kimberly, and thanks to our guests. I'm Saul Newman. I'm the Associate Dean in the School of Public Affairs, where Kimberly is a professor. My question is this, and I have not read the report yet, so I apologize if this is a question that you addressed in the report. I know you mentioned it briefly in your presentation, and that was about question wording. I think of the Scottish referendum question, which was quite clear, as opposed to, for example, the 1980 and 1995 Quebec referenda questions, which were kind of ambiguous, and it was an intentional ambiguity to sort of raise the percentage of the yes vote potentially, and may have had an effect in 1995. Who controls sort of the wording development, and do you anticipate that being a challenge as the sides battle over the wording to try to affect the outcome in some way?
So I can comment on that one, thank you. So if we're talking about the referendum in Northern Ireland, then there are established procedures for agreeing referendum question wording in the UK, set out in legislation. So essentially it is initially for the government ministers to propose question wording. That proposal is then scrutinised by the Electoral Commission to ensure that it is clear and impartial. So the Electoral Commission conducts focus groups, consults with campaigners on all sides, consults with plain language experts in order to assess whether the question is clear to all parts of the community and seen as impartial to all parts of the community, by all parts of the community. It then recommends, on the whole, in most referendums so far, since this regime was introduced in 2000, it has proposed changes to the original proposed question wording. And in all of those cases so far, ministers have accepted those proposals, but they are only proposals. Ultimately, it is for Parliament to decide in passing legislation what the question wording should be. So that's the detailed question wording that process is set out. Of course, the process of getting to a question is in 2 stages. Firstly, you define the proposition that is being put to voters, and then you work out how to express that on the ballot paper. And the proposition, whether it is a model or a process, to use Brendan's word, and so on, is a matter for political decision.
It's worth adding that the Republic of Ireland has a separate procedure for amendments of the Constitution, and that is associated with an established pattern of wording. So what the group has concluded in this respect is that it must be the case that the substantive meaning of the question is the same both sides of the border, but it will necessarily be the case that both the 2 jurisdictions will adopt their own procedures for posing the question.
Well, and as the report talks about, the questions can be different in North and South as they were in 1998, where the voters in the South were asked whether they accepted a change to the Constitution, and the voters in the North were asked whether they would accept the agreement arrived at through the multi-party talks process. And also the question of timing, right? The committee, the working group goes over the options with regard to timing, that they need not necessarily be on the same day, and they need not necessarily have the same wording, but they cannot be substantively different in the sense that the Northern Ireland voters are asked whether they would favor unification, let's say, or remaining part of the United Kingdom, and voters in the South were asked about a particular model for a united Ireland. So I thought that was a very important conclusion that the working group had thought through there in a very useful way for the overall process. I noticed Michelle has posed a question in the chat, and then Dave Lublin. Is that Michelle Egan, and are you here with us?
Yes, it is. Cheers. Do you want me to ask my questions? And I'll turn on my camera.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I will read the report now. You've obviously tapped my interest. And as somebody who has both a British passport and is about to get an Irish one, it matters to me about who votes, residency or citizenship. And I was thinking about this in the context of both Brexit and their recent Scottish referendum. And so why your choice? I do think the question you posed, the external impediment seems significant. And here I thought external impediment framed was the notion of disinformation or external funds. And I think about the Irish diaspora in the United States and what the impact that if there isn't campaign, as you pointed out, changes in campaign rules that might impact the campaign or any disinformation. And then my last question, my last 2 points would be more questions, but Kimberly mentioned liabilities and pensions and so forth. I was thinking about domestic British politics. You know, there was a lot of consternation with Brexit about the $40 billion bill that they had to pay, which was really misinformation. It was obligations and commitments. But what would happen, and do you anticipate that the British government would have to have some fiscal transfers if there was unification? Because I could see that having a domestic fallout in British politics. And then finally, I was struck by the model. Why a binary sovereignty? Should it be done when they're under Irish sovereignty, or should it be done when they're under British sovereignty? And here I was thinking, you know, I don't want to propose a model of GFA or protocol committees because there's tons of those, but I was thinking, you know, I thought back to constitution writing post 89 or previously, where there was a lot of the American Bar Association, there was a lot of experts. So is it possible, instead of sort of thinking about this in terms of under Irish or British sovereignty, whether, given the fact that you are an expert group, whether you would anticipate an expert group coming up with what a post-unification constitutional, political, legal structure would look like, along the lines of the sort of expertise that ABA and others provided to Central and Eastern Europe.
Do you want to go first, Alan?
Okay, I can go first. I won't attempt to answer all of those because Brendan is very much the expert on some of these, but let me offer a few comments at least. Thank you, Michelle, for great questions. On the issue of the franchise, we don't come to a strong conclusion on what the appropriate franchise is. We tend to the view that it is better to stick with franchise rules that already exist rather than trying to create fresh rules sui generis for a particular vote, because the danger of the latter approach is that the rules are crafted by those in power to suit their desired outcome. And that means that, so Ireland has established franchise rules for constitutional amendment referendums. So if it is a constitutional amendment referendum, then there would be an established franchise for that. The UK actually doesn't have an established franchise for referendums. So every time we have a referendum, legislation needs to be passed stipulating the franchise. But it is pretty clearly established practice that you apply the franchise that is used in the parliamentary elections for the corresponding area. So UK-wide referendums typically use the UK parliamentary franchise. Referendums, the Scottish referendum used the Scottish parliamentary franchise, and so on. Curiously, the one exception to this pattern is the 1998 referendum on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which was based on the UK parliamentary franchise when you might have expected it to be based on, at that time, the Northern Ireland local government franchise. So the precedent isn't perfect, and that will no doubt lead to contestation, but we tend to think that applying the Northern Ireland Assembly franchise would be appropriate, and that means essentially UK and Irish citizens and EU citizens now as well who satisfy certain residency requirements in Northern Ireland. On the issue of external impediment, so Brendan will certainly have more to say on this. I mean, what's very clear and what there isn't debate about is that the clause saying that the people of the island of Ireland must make the decision without external impediment does mean that the UK government cannot block the holding of a referendum. That would be an impediment to the people of the island of Ireland making this decision. And similarly cannot block the outcome if people both north and south vote for unification. What is in discussion within the group is whether it also imposes restrictions during the campaign period. And I don't think anyone would suggest that people outside the island of Ireland are not allowed to express opinions. It would be rather difficult to do that. But whether, for example, it would be acceptable for people outside the island of Ireland to campaign, to fund campaigns, to give campaign donations, whether that would be acceptable is clearly a question. There are already rules in both Ireland and the UK saying that public funds cannot be used to campaign for one side in referendums. So those would presumably apply. But there are certainly questions in that area. At that point, perhaps I'll hand over to Brendan, who will no doubt have things to say about those and also is much better than I am on your other questions.
I think Alan has said nothing with which I disagree. I agree entirely, in fact, with what he's just said. The phrase without external impediment, Michelle, does come from the deliberate preference of Irish nationalists for centuries to make decisions about their future without British external impediment. That's the implied adjective in front of external impediment, though it's not there in the text. As a group, we all agree we don't want Russian bots. As a group, we all want to make sure there's a campaign space which, as much as possible, is deliberative and not saturated with disinformation. So there are recommendations in the report for both jurisdictions on improving their campaign conduct rules, and obviously it will be desirable, though difficult to accomplish, harmonization in those. In all breakups and transfers of sovereignty, there are citizenship questions, there are boundary questions, and there are questions of the distribution of assets and liabilities. The group carefully does not take a view on how exactly these should be processed. And we do, however, make a clear distinction between transfer of sovereignty questions and unification questions and the pattern of a future united Ireland. As a matter of fact, the UK, when it acknowledged the formation of the Irish Free State, took on the pension liabilities of all officers in the Irish civil service up until the point at which the Irish Free State Constitution came into existence. So it would be surprising if there weren't similar commitments on a much larger scale than those of 1920. It would be for the two governments to negotiate any transitional arrangements in terms of fiscal withdrawal and assuming of fiscal responsibilities by a unified Irish government. I think that your paying to experts in post-1989 Eastern Europe would not be universally acknowledged. We do think, and I do think you just can't avoid some dichotomous questions. Either there is going to be a unified Ireland or there isn't. Either there's going to be a Northern Ireland inside the Union or there isn't. Shared sovereignty and joint sovereignty is ruled out by the Good Friday Agreement. And we take that as our disciplinary corset. We don't try to think outside it. And it follows from that a decision has to be made how quickly the model of a unified Ireland is enacted, and where those negotiations, if there are negotiations as opposed to implementing an agreed model, where they take place. That simply cannot be avoided. And experts have their place, but we should be on tap and not on top. Constitutional processes require the citizens to be involved. We can help, but that's all we can do. Well.
Good, thank you. David, I noticed you've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, thanks, Kimberly, and thanks for organizing this very interesting webinar, and to both of the participants for joining us. I have several questions which I'm afraid are disjointed, but I'll ask them anyway. The first is, how does the South feel about this? In terms of, I wonder, is it much like South Korea where it wants unification, but in the future, with the future always being later? Or is there a sort of a genuine desire to move forward with the difficulties of this? The second is, if a referendum fails, as in Scotland, are there provisions to prevent sort of endless repeat referendums immediately for a generation or something like that? And the third question is more broadly, ironically, sort of putting the provisions for referendums in the Good Friday Agreement, or the possibility of unification, I think was part of the key to its success. But I wonder, could the referendum itself and the process essentially rip Northern Ireland apart? Well, perhaps this doesn't seem to have occurred to such a great extent in Scotland. I was really struck by how Quebec was just absolutely rent for many, many years. And to this day, there's almost a desire not to have a referendum simply because of the emotional toll it took on everybody. And given that Northern Ireland's been far more frayed and had a violent history that has mercifully been largely eliminated by the Good Friday Agreement and excellent efforts, could this essentially redescend the region into real problems as a result? And I don't know the solution to that either, but anyway, I look forward to hearing your thoughts, because Northern Ireland continues to remain interesting despite its best efforts to become uninteresting.
Indeed. I'll answer your second question first, if that's okay, Alan. Under the agreement, there is a provision for a future referendum no earlier than 7 years after the previous one. There is no provision to end the possibility of referendums, but there is a 7-year time interval. So if there was a close outcome, one would expect that those who lost would hope to accomplish a second referendum 7 years later. If that had existed in the case of Scotland, perhaps that would have restrained conduct by English politicians in recent times. So there is a key difference between Scotland and Northern Ireland. Legally, it appears, though it is yet to be tested, that having a referendum depends on Westminster's say-so in the case of Scotland. In the case of Northern Ireland, there's a process that must be followed, and it's available every 7 years. The South does not have one voice or view on unification. There is a distinct small minority that opposes unification. There are large numbers of people who like it. There are large numbers of people who want to know what costs it would involve. And those costs are conceived of both economically and politically, how to deal with a potentially recalcitrant and unhappy minority. So it would be wrong to portray Southern views as unanimous. The current government, led by the current Taoiseach, is promoting a shared island initiative. And I think it's now unambiguously clear that it is doing that in order to avoid talking about the prospect of united Ireland. By contrast, other parts of public opinion in the South, especially led by Sinn Féin, want to advance preparation and are looking forward to the possibility of a referendum by the end of the decade. So it's not right to represent Southern opinion in one way. If you asked me as a professional political scientist if there was a referendum in the next 5 years, I would say that Dublin will vote no, but the majority of Ireland will vote yes. There will be a divergence of opinion, but there will be a strong level of support for unification. The question of violence always raises its head in Irish politics. The hoped for proceduralism of the Good Friday Agreement allows, and we think about this carefully in the design of the referendum process, in effect, what we're thinking through is what's required to achieve losers' consent. Whether the losers be Northern nationalists and some of the others who want to reunify the island within the European Union, or whether the losers are unionists who want to preserve the link to Great Britain. We can only set out what we think are reasonable processes and clear processes. We can't guarantee that nobody will try to sabotage those. We can't guarantee that policing structures will remain absolutely stable and so on. Those questions will always lurk in the background, and that's why constitutional design of the appropriate model or process is so important. It has to make it clear what the future position of a potentially losing minority is going to be, what rights assurances it can expect in such circumstances. I would say this, that if Northern Unionists lose, it's not at all clear what the violence would accomplish. It certainly won't guarantee that Britain will come to restore their position. If they try to create an independent Northern Ireland, the demographic restructuring of Northern Ireland makes that extraordinarily difficult. It's no longer the case that the 4 northeastern counties would deliver a completely homogeneous structure. They'd have to carve out a new unit. So in my view, it's increasingly less plausible that they have the alternative of a unilateral declaration of independence.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we're out of time unless somebody has something quick they wanted to run past the committee. We can provide the committee, the working group's emails. There is, in fact, at the end of the report, a way to get in touch with the working group if you have feedback to deliver to them. They have at a couple different points in their interim report a list of questions they are seeking feedback on specifically, in addition to the ones that Brendan mentioned here. And I invite you all to take part in that process if you have something to add. Thank you to our speakers. We're very grateful to this very thoughtful discussion, and we're grateful to your work as part of the working group. I think you have done an enormous service in laying out the implications of such a wide array of options at different points in this process and illuminating the challenges therein. I'd also like to thank our guests. We have a number of guests from all across DC and part of the broader community. We're also very glad to welcome our students and our faculty, and very glad you could be part of this. Thank you again, all of you, and especially, can we do a virtual sort of applause to our speakers? Thank you, in whatever format. If you, in the reactions, I think there we go, a hand clapping. Again, thank you for your time, and thank you to our events people for making it